10-point day on the market, 10% gains. We got some nice food, and now you get to listen to an economist. Could the day get any better? And yes, the answer is yes, it could, because I'm not going to speak for as long as the economics classes were back in school. Most people couldn't stay awake for 45, 50 minutes. What I'd like to do over the next 25, 30 minutes is have a discussion with you, ranging from the short term to the long term. Now, I will tell you, right, obviously, I was sitting there at the middle of today trying to figure out everything that was going on. There were a couple. I was out yesterday. I had a lunch with advisors in Oak Brook. I had a dinner last night in Schaumburg, and we were having a lot of the conversations that we saw kind of come to fruition today. We were talking about some of the concerns related to tariffs and how long they were likely to be here, the impact they were likely, and I was prepared to have that conversation today. And then Trump said, hold on, scratch it. Other than China, and we're bringing their rates over 100%, everybody else, we're doing a 90-day wait. And some of those countries, I'm sure, are celebrating. Some of them, I'll be honest, when the news came out in the Rose Garden last week, I was giving talks in Hawaii last week, one of the toughest weeks of the year, okay? And he started listing the names of the countries that were being impacted. I had to look a couple of these countries up, okay? There were some of them, like, have you heard of the Heard and McDonald Islands? Yeah. I had not heard of them before this, so I looked them up. I said, why are we putting a 10% tariff on them? What do they do? What do they sell? So I looked them up. Do you know what their population is? Penguins. 0. All that's there is penguins, but apparently those penguins are really tough negotiators. But they got the reprieve today. As we were having the conversation yesterday, without knowing that today there was going to be this pushback, and again, it's a 3-month pushback. It doesn't mean that everything's off the table. They said, President Trump came out and said, hey, right, we've talked to 50, 60, 70 other countries. They saw the tariffs come in. They said, let's have a discussion. They've approached us. They want to figure out. The EU came out and said, hey, we understand. We know there's some concerns. We've got a proposal too. We're going to put some things in on steel and aluminum, but we'll talk to you. We want to talk to you about 0% tariffs. Let's bring this rate down on both sides. Now, over the next 30, 60, 90 days, we're going to have to see how this all plays out. But I'll tell you, as this was going on, as they escalated, before they started escalating, I was looking at the data. Our team is ranked the #2 economics team in the world, actually, for forecasting the U.S. economy. There's 78 groups that submit every single week, every single month, every single quarter, every single year. We've been in the top 3 for 5 consecutive years, the only team up there. And our strength has come from our belief that data really matters, that history matters. So as we started to go through and started to look at things like the tariff, what was the starting point for the discussion with the tariffs? Well, here's the number as we saw them. President Trump came out, he put some numbers on his board, and I'll be honest, I couldn't quite match up the numbers he was saying, but here was the idea. Here is the United States. This is the average tariff rate that we charge other countries. This is calculated by the World Trade Organization. These other countries that are on here, the other 10 blue lines, are the 10 largest trading partners of the United States. And coming into this year, and over the last 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, this has been an ongoing discussion. Both Democrats and Republicans have been having it. They've said, look, we have the lowest tariff rates among all of our trading partners. When are we going to see movement from other countries towards where we are at? Now, I think everybody knew, and this is where the escalation is happening, China's been a concern. If you remember, Trump put tariffs on China back during his first administration. Biden raised those. The issue that we've had with China is that they misunderstood the word copyright. Okay, they thought it meant the right to copy. It's a translation issue. And the administrations have come and said, look, we're producing, U.S. companies are producing products. They're bringing it to your markets. You're taking the technology, you're reproducing it under your own brand. You're stealing intellectual property. This can't continue. You need to see rates start moving in this direction. Now, what did we see during the first Trump administration? We've been seeing along the way echoes of what was likely to come in terms of impacts from tariffs or how long they were going to last. I want to look back at what happened during Trump 1.0, because now that China's back in the crosshairs, back in the focus, everyone else has been pushed to the background. I think you're very likely to see something similar to what we saw during the first administration. When we put the tariffs in place, this is 2018. In 2018, tariffs go in place. We raised them on solar. We raised them on batteries. We raised them on steel and aluminum because they said China's dumping. They're being state subsidized. We can't compete. We've got concerns on other areas. And so they said, look, we're going to raise the tariffs. Now, during 2018, During 2019, as we started this escalation with China, did we see a decline in total US imports? Did the US buy less internationally than they did before the tariffs were put in place? And the answer is no. Right? China reciprocated, we went back and forth with China, but during that time period, what we saw take place is that businesses faced with uncertainty, trying to determine where do they go from there, said, well, if China's at the crosshairs, and this has been an ongoing theme for 3, 4, 5, 10 years, we're going to start looking for potentially more stable, more reliable places to be. So we started to see companies moving from China to Vietnam. We started seeing companies move from China to Taiwan. They moved to Malaysia. Some of the soft goods moved to places like France. And what we did is we kept growing, we kept importing. We actually saw the value of total global trade rise year in and year out. It fell in 2020 when we went through COVID. That was a disruptive year, but since then, we've been back. And I do think you're going to see something similar this year. Now, some of the negotiations, take the EU for example, the US said, hey, we're sending cars to you. Every time we send a US car to the EU, you charge us 10% to bring it in. You send us a car, we charge 2.5%. This is where the negotiation started. The idea behind reciprocal tariffs was we can do this either way. If you want to come down to 2.5%, we'll stay at 2.5%. But if you don't want to come down, if you want to keep yours at 10%, we're going to come up to 10%. What happened, essentially, if you go back through history, is that the US, as the leaders coming out of World War II, while particularly Europe was recovering, the US made concessions and said, we are on stronger footing. The war wasn't so much on our soil. We didn't see the same level of destruction that you saw. You rebuild, you regrow, you get the affairs in order. You can put protections as those industries come back and get strength. And as they do, the expectation was we would move in this direction. But we haven't really seen that much. And that's the question of where are we going to go here over the next year or 2 years? Will we see movement from here down in this direction? Or was the US going to move over here? I do believe that we're going to see gradually movement over here. And this time around, Mexico and Canada have been at the center of the early discussions. What we saw with those two countries is playing out again on the broader scale. Do you remember, we started off with Canada and Mexico and said 25% tariffs. And those countries were mad. If you turned on the hockey games, they were booing the national anthem. And I was like, wow, these are two of our closest. Mexico is our #1 trading partner, and Canada is right on the edge of bumping China off for #2. Now, those tariffs went in place. They went in place over a weekend. The very first time they got implemented, on Monday morning, the market tried to figure out what's going on. That morning, I was flying. I'm on the road about 125 nights of the year. I'm based here. This is actually the closest event I've ever had to my house. Thank you. But I spend most of my times, Monday morning, I drive over to O'Hare, I head out from O'Hare, I cover the entire United States, Canada, Mexico, Chile, Peru, Israel, and Japan, okay? So I've had the conversations with Canada, I've had them with Mexico. In fact, in 2-3 weeks, I'm heading to Mexico City to talk with their investors. When this happened, that morning I was flying to New York. And everyone's trying to figure out how long are we going to tariff Canada and Mexico? How deep is this going to go? I got on the flight that morning. It was an 8:08 a.m. flight with United. I got on the flight that morning. We had tariffs in place on Canada and Mexico. I took an hour and 58-minute flight, and when I landed, we no longer had tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And they said, we're going to push it back for a month. Not 3 months, that time it was a month. Now, a month later, it hits again. It hits again over a weekend. Okay, that morning, it was a Monday morning once again. This time I'm flying out to California. I get there, it's a 7:30 a.m. flight. I get on the flight, we have tariffs on Canada and Mexico. I take a 4-hour, 4-minute flight to land in San Francisco, right? I get off, once again, we're gone with the tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Trump has a tendency to escalate to negotiate. And it drives people nuts. As an economist, it makes my job harder because you never know if he's really serious. You never know. So here's what I've been doing. I've been playing the 72-hour rule. This is what the 72, it will save you a lot of stress. The 72-hour rule means when Trump says something, wait 72 hours and see if he does something. Because we've seen multiple iterations where something comes into place, that escalation starts, and what happens? Why did those tariffs go away on Monday morning with Canada and Mexico? Because it escalated and the country said, let's have a discussion. Let's have a negotiation. By the time the Rose Garden discussion statement was finishing, last week, Wednesday, there were already multiple trade delegations that had arrived in Washington saying, whatever the number, we haven't seen them yet, but we want to have a discussion. Now, I went back and I looked through history because one of the questions was, maybe he's not kidding this time. Maybe this is going to go on longer. How deep could the pain be? And I started hearing people talk about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. One of the biggest impacts that a trade negotiation, a trade fight has ever had in the United States. And then I started looking at our economy and I said, how similar are we today to where we were back then? If you go back to the 1920s, goods were about 70% of the US economy. And by the way, at that point, we were a net exporter. Now we're a net importer. We buy more than we send out. But back then, 70% of our activity was on the goods side, which means services was 30%. So when those tariffs went in place and the average tariff rate was around 40 to 50%, this had a notable impact on a large number of companies. Now, this time around, these two numbers are exactly flopped. Not exactly. Here it's 69% goods, 31%. I'm sorry, 69% services, 31% goods. Our exposure this time was a little different. Now, of this 31%, let's call it 30 to make the math easier, 30%, roughly half of this, 15% of total consumption, is brought in from outside the country. Roughly half of it is produced here. So then they started looking and saying, okay, 15% is outside the country. Now, you might have noticed Canada and Mexico were not included in the new tariff rates that went in. We negotiated with them already. We said, you're exempt. By the way, who else is exempt? Lumber. Who else is exempt? Copper. Who else is exempt? Any energy products. And then companies could apply for one-by-one exemptions. In 2018, when the steel and aluminum tariffs went into effect, close to 500,000 companies applied for exemption. Close to Now, you had a medical device company come in and say, really? We make pacemakers. We make the IVs that get used in hospitals. And they said, okay, you're right, you get an exemption. And the people that made the child car seats came in and said, these are for the kids. It's going to just cost more to protect the kids. And they said, fine, you get an exemption. It turned the tariffs into a bit of Swiss cheese. But if we just assume that everybody else keeps the tariffs, that they get fully applied, but you strip out Canada and Mexico, you're talking about a 10% impact. 10% of what we consume, roughly, and I just found out today the San Francisco Federal Reserve ran their calculations. They came to the exact same number. This was the number they were looking at and saying 10%, if everything went away, this could be the impact. Now, during Smoot-Hawley, we didn't see everything go away. It's not that we stopped buying things. You don't say, oh, shoes cost 20% more. I'm just not going to wear shoes anymore. Right? People will pay a little more when the cars cost more, but you need a car. You pay a little more. If the gas costs more, but you want to heat the house, you want to drive the car, you pay a little more. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But even in that situation, in Smoot-Hawley, we saw a decline of about 55% in global trade. So we started running the numbers and we said, okay, now we're talking about 5% roughly downside on the consumers. And then I said, well, can we tell from history? Because the markets were bottoming out. The markets were freaking out. We didn't yet know how long this would go into effect. It hadn't even hit yet. They'd been talked about, numbers proposed, but no real transactions going through. So I started to go back and I looked at every presidency over the last 70, 100 years. Right? 70 to 100 years, and I said both sides of the aisle, Republicans, Democrats, they've both done this, they put in tariffs. Can we find areas that were similar to today? Smoot-Hawley being one. Go back to the chicken tax, okay, that took place back under Kennedy. You can go back all the way and you can look at Nixon in 71, 10% across the board. And that's what's being talked about right now. When they removed those higher tariff rates for the next 90 days, they said we're bringing everybody down to 10%. Now in 71, the discussion Nixon was having, he said, look, we have trade imbalances. I want to fix that. Look, we think other countries are manipulating their currency. I want to fix that. Similar conversations to today. Now, 1971, then I started to look and said, how much economic impact did it have? How much market impact did it have? Now, these numbers are a little bit hard to see, okay? But I'll tell you, I looked and I said, how did we do in 1970? Oh, the market was up 14.3%. Now, those tariffs were in place for 4 months, not 4 days, and we were less than that so far this time. They were in place for 4 months, and the markets did okay. And then somebody asked me the other day, they said, well, maybe that's because the impact was felt later. And I said, 1972, we were up 19.9. How about other situations? 1981, Japan is booming. And the US auto industry said, well, that's kind of we're concerned. Japan is ruling the world. They're taking all the manufacturing. They're taking the manufacturing jobs. We need to protect industries. And they said, look, 1981, we actually did have a decline. And I'll note in 2018, when we saw the stuff going on with China this time around, we also saw a decline. Now, those were modest declines. They weren't large declines, but I also want to note what happened next. If you go from 1981 to 1982, as we got through the turbulence at the beginning, we had 1982 where the markets were up over 20%, 1983 over 20%. If you go from 2018 to 2019, 31.5%. And I started to look at the data. And the deeper I dove into the data, it said, yes, we get heartburn, we get indigestion, there's fear, there's emotion. Uncertainty always brings with it emotion. It brings with it concern. This time was no different. We'll look at the data. What you see, if you go back through the history of the markets, is that nearly every year we have a 10% or greater pullback. Nearly every single year. We forget this, right? But there is tremendous volatility. Now, typically when you see that volatility, it's a great opportunity to buy, because we've always gone back up. But we look through the history, and then I had somebody say, well, Andrew, maybe the markets do fine. But the real concern I have is inflation. Even if it's 10% or China there's a lot of iPhones that come out of China. There's a lot of technology that comes out of China. Isn't that going to hit me? So this is where I think one of the biggest disconnects takes place. Understanding inflation. And I think even the Fed gets this wrong. Do you remember back in 2020 when we had the really strange months of March and April of 2020? You all remember March and April 2020? You're never going to forget March and April 2020. When we weren't sure if we were allowed to go to the grocery store, right? We weren't sure if Starbucks was going to be open. This is when we all survived the great toilet paper run of 2020. But on the back half of that, as we started to reopen, and concerns were how far is the economy going to drop, we had 2 months, the worst 2 months for employment that we'd seen in 100 years. We had the worst 2 months that we had ever seen from an economic pullback. Let me just remind you that that year, where we had a global pandemic, ended the year down 10 million jobs, we're still at home, weren't back at the offices. That year, okay, 2020, 18.4%. Now, that year, right, we got a test on inflation. People were trying, and the Fed had said, look, we hadn't had inflation for nearly a decade. They told you. Do you remember hearing this on TV? They said, don't worry about inflation. If anything shows up, it's going to be their favorite word for 2 years, transitory. So let's test that. I looked at this and said, well, here's how I understand inflation. Here's how my mom, okay, I grew up in Naperville, born and raised in Naperville. Okay, my mom is a dental hygienist. When she talks to me about inflation, I said, Mom, here's how to think about inflation. Okay, imagine you lived in a world with two things, $10 and 10 apples. How much is an apple going to cost? She's counting it up on her hand fingers. She's like, oh, it's $1 an apple. Okay? I said, you're right. $10 chasing 10 apples. The dollars they chase the goods. You get $1 per apple. Now, why did we see inflation during COVID? Two things happened. We had more dollars and we had less apples. With supply chains shut down, but the PPP loans, the direct stimulus checks, the additional unemployment benefits. This year, when the inflation, this was a year we were #1 in the forecasting, because we said, look, inflation's going to come. Now, you take $13 chasing 5 apples, the inflation would have been massive, over 100%. And the Fed said it's not going to be that bad, because what's going to happen is you're going to have 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 come back. The economy's going to return. I said, I agree with you. I absolutely think the economy will return. They said, yeah, so inflation is transitory. I said, but wait a second, the money's not leaving. If you have $13 and the economy gets back to 100%, $13 and 10 apples versus $10 and 10 apples, what's going to happen here to the price of an apple? It's going to go up. And so what was happening during this time period is that we weren't going to stay in the worst case scenario, right? But we weren't going back here, we were going to go over here. Now the Fed felt so confident they understood inflation, they told us, no. The money doesn't matter. If you watch what we do by the end of 2021, inflation's going to be down to 1.7%. 1.7%. They had it to the decimal. Did we get down to 1.7% in 21? No, we did not. We ended the year at 7.0%. So to their credit, right, they got one of the numbers right. Now they missed the boat. And now we sit here looking today at the tariffs, and this was a major discussion point the Fed has been talking about. They said, well, if you have the tariffs, you're going to have inflation. We might have to act, or we might have to hold. We started cutting rates last year. We got to figure this thing out. And I said, hold on a second. Let's go back to our chart. If you've got $10 and 10 apples, let's start at the same point, and let's think about how tariffs impact. I'm going to call this apple a car. And this car, it is going to cost you more. We've got steel and aluminum. We still have some things going on with other nations and components come in. This apple is going to cost you 15% more. Okay? And here's the bad news. You have to buy the car. Your car is going to break down tonight. I'm sorry, I don't know the reason, but whatever part is needed to fix it is gone. You have to buy this. That's the worst case scenario. What happens if car prices go up 15%? We'll go back to 1981. People said, well, can I buy a used car? Because the used cars don't have the tariff. Those ones are already here. Can I just repair my car? Can I use public transit for a little bit? Let's wait this out. I'm telling you, no, you can't. You are going to see 15% higher prices. And you have to pay it. Now, let me ask you a question. I think I know the answer to this. Is your income going to go up 15% because of the tariffs? No. If it was, would you be that concerned? If things cost 15% more, but you got paid 15% more, most people would say, well, I'm paying more, but I'm getting the same stuff. I'm not concerned. But if you're not getting 15% more, and some people are concerned, well, the market's going to go down, that impact, maybe I've even got less dollars. If you have the same amount of money or less, and that car goes up, you can see inflation in products, you can see it in sectors, but now I want you to think about the other 9 apples. If you have to pay 15% to get that car, and you need that car, what does that mean about your capacity to pay in other areas? This is historically what we've seen. You have to pay more for the car, it turns out, during those time periods. Oil prices go up, car prices go up. There's 2 things people tend to do less, and we're already seeing it. People tend to eat out less, they do less leisure and hospitality, and they tend to travel less. Flying out to Hawaii, this is the first time. I head out there once or twice a year. This is the first time in 5 years. No, since 2014. This is the first time in 4 years that the plane was not oversold. And I see this as I go through the airport. And so I look at this and say, hey, economy-wide, I don't think inflation is going to have a massive impact. You go back to 71 to 72, inflation actually fell. It still rose, but not at the same pace. It moved slower in 72 than it did in 71, and that was slower than what it did in 70. There's a lot of misconceptions that sound right on the surface because you see a product and say, yes, that's inflation. But we have to look at the broader picture. Now, the Fed has their own problem. The Fed's been battling inflation. They got the numbers wrong. After they told us 1.7% and only missed by 5.3%, they told us in 2022 we're going to raise rates 3 times. And if we do that, inflation is going to come down to 2. Now, that year they raised rates the equivalent of 17 rate hikes. So that year they only missed by 14. And then they started to cut. Last year they started to cut, late year. They started to cut rates, started cutting by 0.5%, then they did 2 quarter-point cuts. Why did they feel the need to start cutting? Because inflation during that time period started to move sideways. Well, they started to see some issues on the jobs front. Now, you look at this chart, and this is the same chart that'll show up the first Friday of every month when we get the jobs report. This is the one that typically, something like this or the unemployment rate shows up on CNBC. And people have been pointing to this and saying, well, why would the Fed be worried about the jobs market? The growth here looks pretty similar to the growth back here. It seems like things are going okay. Yes, we had, right, the 2-month time period, which was dramatic, but then we recovered. And as we got back to it and the jobs came back and we had that weird 3-month time period where Peloton was the greatest company on earth. Do you remember that? It made sense at the time. This is another thing. Emotion, in the moment, a lot of this makes sense. In the moment, people are like, yeah, I can't go to the gym. Lifetime's not open. So I'm going to buy a Peloton. I'm going to buy 2 Pelotons. And I'm going to put them in the basement, and me and my spouse are going to wake up every morning. We're going to cycle against the neighbors, right? And when COVID was over, the U.S. was supposed to be the healthiest nation on earth. And it lasted for 2 weeks, because that's how long it takes you to realize you don't like cycling. And then Peloton cratered. But we came back, and not only did we come back, we've got more people working now than we've ever had before. So why worry? Well, the reason they started to get concerned is they were looking at where the jobs were coming from. And they said, well, the job gains over here don't look like the job gains over here. Now, I travel, okay, again, just about every single week. 3 to 4 weeks of the month, I'm typically traveling, talking with financial advisors. The other week during the month, I talk with small, mid-sized, large-sized businesses. I talk almost exclusively with owner-operators because I want to hear what they're seeing across the country, what they're seeing, what they're experiencing. And this chart, every time I brought it up, they said, that's not our experience. We see this, we hear this on TV, but it doesn't match what we're living. And I said, you're absolutely right. You are absolutely right. This doesn't match what you're seeing, and here's the reason why. There are two sectors that have dominated job gains here over the last 18 to 24 months. What two sectors, far and away, have dominated employment gains in the United States? Government's number one. Healthcare is number two, which is the largest government subsidized sector. And I said, look, I see you guys. I look at government and healthcare, and I look at everyone else. All the restaurants, the bars, the hotels, the financial industry, the construction industry, the manufacturing industry, right? I look across that and said, over this roughly 18-month period, you did not have a single month where the entire rest of the economy outpaced the gains in government and healthcare. And not only that, we had, let's count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 months. Roughly half the time where they were seeing outright declines. And they said, we're feeling something different. And the Fed said, look, yes, we understand small, mid-sized businesses. We understand particularly the service side of the economy. You guys have had some difficulty because when we said, let's bring the world inside, a lot of employees moved down here. A lot of investment dollars moved down here. And they haven't seen them come back. Now, this perplexed the Fed. And this is an area where I don't blame the Fed for being a bit confused, because what happened over the last 18, 24 months is the exact opposite of what your economics textbook would say if you ever got stuck in an economics class, okay? I'm going to assume you've never taken an economics class, though, and I want to explain to you for the next 3 minutes what happened that threw everybody off, okay? You, for the next 3 minutes, I want you to pretend you own a manufacturing company. You own a goods production company. Choose whatever industry, choose whatever thing you want to produce. I am a group called the Institute for Supply Chain Manufacturing. And what I do is I come to you every month and I say, can I ask you a couple simple questions? Are your orders up or down? Is your production up or down? Is your employment up or down? Are your order backlogs, how much work you have to do beyond your orders, is that up or down, and how are prices? Simple questions. I've been asking you this for decades. And you and your peers in this room, across the industries, across the sectors, for the entirety of 2023, the entirety of 2024, 24 months straight, said our orders are down, our production's down, we've worked through backlogs, we're not hiring, but we're not firing, and prices are still a problem. Okay? This is where you found yourself. You run this business, you own this business, you hired the workers, this is their livelihood. You put your blood, sweat, and tears, your own money into building this business, and now I want to ask you, knowing that, this business that you run, that's had orders down, production down, order backlogs run through, for 24 of 24 months, are you thinking to yourself, this seems like a great time to build a new factory? Maybe I should add a new product line. This is the great time to expand. Or are you sitting there thinking, man, this is tough. We just went through this boom time period, which quite honestly nobody expected. We didn't know it was coming, and we had to struggle through that. It was a good struggle because the demand was there. Maybe we had record years. But now that this has been flat for 2 consecutive years, we're going to use what we have. We're going to use who we have. We're going to get through this because demand always returns, but we got to be patient. Are you on side A, let's invest heavily, or side B, let's tighten the belt buckle? B. What did happen? The largest growth in manufacturing construction spend we've ever seen. Over this time period, we saw a tripling in spend on manufacturing construction. It defies logic, right? But then I'm sitting there and I'm having these conversations with owner-operators, and I'm sitting there having a conversation with a recently retired Fortune 500 CEO. And I said, why? He said, it makes a lot of sense if you see it from our end. Well, no, it wasn't essential workers. What happened here is he said, we were in this space. We were in this group that had to struggle through 2020 into 2021, where the demand was there, it exceeded anything that we could produce, and we were part of the group that has had orders down, production down. But the government came to us and said, look, we're doing two things. We're doing a CHIPS Act, we're doing an Inflation Reduction Act. We're going to put money in the system. We want to bring some of this production to the United States. We really want to emphasize technology. We want you to build facilities. We know you don't have the work to do now, but build these facilities now, and we'll help pay for the cost. He said, they came to me and said, I'll pay 40%. Now, if you're the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and the government says, I'm paying for 40% of your project if you start now, he said, I sat there and I had to ask myself this question, when will it be done? 4 to 5 years. In 2021 to 2022, he has to look out and say, is my demand going to be there in 4 to 5 years? Hopefully. I'll have to staff it in 4 to 5 years. But if I wait for more certainty, if I wait a year or 2 years to just see how much this recovers, they're not going to offer me 40% anymore. This is a one-time offer. So we saw this pickup in activity. And let me remind you, during this time period, interest rates rose. You don't typically see people going out and buying more homes when it's more expensive to borrow and buy a home. You don't see people buying more cars when it's more expensive to borrow and buy a car. You don't see this with businesses. So what we saw was this weird situation where we fixed some of the issues on the good side of the equation, but we transferred the problem to services. And the Fed said, look, this is tough for us to handle. We didn't expect it to run out this way. We've had some difficulty with the models. We weren't sure what was going to happen with tariffs. If tariffs had stayed in place long term, what you would have seen this year is the service side heavily impacted down because they move away from leisure and hospitality. We move away from services in that environment, and you would have seen these good prices move higher. And we spent a lot of time looking about this, and thinking about this. And then I stopped and said, why don't we spend more time thinking about this? Consider this chart. Consider what happened during this time period, right? We're coming out of the financial crisis. We had Grexit, Brexit, the BP oil spill, H1N1, Zika. We had multiple down years in terms of major market pullbacks. And let me just remind you, here's the really weird thing. Here's 2018. Here is 2018. That year I told you we were down. That was the year we also got the tax cuts, and we're likely to see tax cuts extended at the end of this year. That was another year where emotions led the day. Despite the fact that earnings were up over 20%, emotions led. We saw the markets decline. Now, we ultimately got the payback because the math wins out over time. And what we saw was in the year 2019, despite earnings being relatively flat, I showed you the number, we had a 30% return. Emotions can win out in the short term, but they don't win out over time. And as we grow, that's why we have more returns on this side than we do on this side. When I start looking at what drives us over time, you begin to realize that very few years, very few markets have been dominated by whether or not the Fed raised or lowered rates in one certain month that year. Very few of these came down to a decision that came out of Washington. What you realize is that a lot of this activity is being driven by the people, the entrepreneurship, the innovation, and you take this step back and you start thinking about things, right, that go well above what you hear about on TV. I really got this stuck to me. My wife's grandfather lives down in Alsip, 40-ish minutes from here. Last year, he turned 100 years old. In October, we held his 100th birthday party at the VFW. And he sat there with 17 great-grandchildren. And we were taking the pictures, and it was incredible. We had like 100 people in this room. He was the longest standing member of that VFW. And as the grandkids got up and they went to go get cake, you could see tears in his eyes. And I went up to him like, Grandpa Dahl, what's going on? He said, Andrew, he said, the things I've seen in my life. I was born in the Great Depression. I grew up in the Great Depression. I fought in World War II. I fought in the Korean War. My kids fought in the Vietnam War. I went through the 70s. I went through the inflation. I had a mortgage at 18.5%, right? I went through the market crash in 1987. I went through the dot-com bubble. I went through 9/11. I went through the financial crisis. I went through COVID. And now we got this. He says, the best advice I can give to the next generation? I'm like, what is it, Grandpa Dahl? He said, turn off the TV. I said, amen. And then he pointed me to this chart. And I spent a lot of time looking at this chart. This is global adult literacy. And he said, what matters is unleashing the potential of people, giving people a chance to surprise you, giving people a chance to produce, giving people a chance to perform. And he said it was in 1963, okay? 1963 was the first time ever in human history that more than half of the world's adult population was literate. And he said, do you think it's a coincidence that this chart and this chart are moving in opposite directions? This is the percent of the world population living in extreme poverty. It turns out that as people have the capacity to learn, and they're walking around today with technology in their pockets that exceeds what the President of the United States had access to 25 years ago. We've got better access to medication, sanitation, nutrition than ever before. And I looked at this chart and I said, wow, that's an impressive chart. But what does it mean? And so I took these numbers, right, and I broke them down. Because I'm a math guy, I'm a bit of a nerd, and here's my last chart. But I just want you to understand the magnitude of what's happening today. This is the World Health Organization that puts together the data. They have, World Bank, they measure extreme poverty internationally. The number of people living on $1.90 or less per day, and this is inflation adjusted over time. And I said, what have we done over the last 20 years? Well, if we go back, last full year data we have is 2023, so I went to 2003, 1.6 billion people living in extreme poverty. Now let's go to 2023, 20 years later, 714 million. Is that 714 million too many? Yeah. But then I saw this number. That means over 20 years, we moved over 900 million people out of extreme poverty. There were 7,305 days. That means we've averaged, over that 20-year period, day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out, year in, year out, we averaged 124,000 people per day moving out of extreme poverty. I grew up in Naperville. I grew up in Naperville before Naperville was Naperville. I remember when we got our Eddie Bauer and thought we finally made it. Today, Naperville has what, 150,000 people? I mean, you consider this, that just over every 24 hours, the world is seeing this population move out of extreme poverty. And you know, I watch that, and I look at some of these numbers, and I'll tell you, when I look at that, and I look at this, okay, one of the biggest trends that's been happening is that as the world moves out of poverty, they want more of what we have. They want more access to the technology. They want more access to the creature comforts. They want more access to the leisure. We've seen more movement towards the US rather than away. I hated the tariffs. I don't like the tariffs. I don't like the fighting. I hope we do, and I think we will move towards freer trade. It won't be free trade, but we'll move towards fairer trade in a free country. It was an incredibly powerful thing. And as we continue to unleash potential, my 7-year-old, my 10-year-old at home, I'm excited on where we go. There's always going to be something to worry about for the next week, next month. Can anyone in here think of a week that's gone by in their lifetime where the news, when they turned on the TV, was generally positive? But this is happening. Let's not lose sight of that. Now, I told you I was going to talk for 25, 30 minutes. I went over. I went 37 minutes. So I apologize for speaking longer than I said. We are going to have some time for Q&A, but first I'm going to pass things back. We'll have a couple comments, and then I'll step back up to talk about any questions you have on things we talked about or didn't talk about. But for now, let me pass things over.